Welcome to Sexology, a podcast that untangles the science of sex and pleasure. And now, with this week's episode, your host, clinical psychologist, Dr. Nazanin Moali.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 13 of Sexology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nazanin Moali. I'm so glad you are here today. You're going to hear my conversation with Pam Costa on sexuality and shame. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about. I see it often, comes up in my session with my clients and also with my friends. And it's very important to understand how you can overcome and move past sexual shame, and what do you need to understand how it works and how it affects us. And it comes in a very subtle way. Oftentimes, people have struggles around experiencing pleasure and desire. And when we get to it, we understand it's because of the shame they have around their sexuality, around their bodies, about shame about sex being sinful. So I'm very excited to offer this conversation. And my guest today is Mrs. Pamela Costa. After a decade and a half at Apple and Facebook, Pam left her career in high tech to found Down to There to share her real life stories of challenges and success around sexuality in her marriage. She believes that speaking openly about sex can help individuals and couples find new ways to renew and deepen desire and intimacy in their own relationships. She also believes in the healing power of sharing and is currently conducting research on this with Down to There circles, free peer-led discussion groups to help friends support and inspire each other around sex and relationships. She is currently a student in JFK's Holistic Counseling Program and the Somatica Institute. Here's my conversation with Pam Costa. Hope you enjoy it. Welcome back to another episode of Sexology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nazanin Moali. And on today's show, we're going to talk about sexuality and shame and how shame and the feeling we have about ourselves, about others can impact our relationships and our sexuality. I'm super excited, as I said during the introduction, about our guest today. We have Mrs. Pamela Costa, the founder of Down to There. And thank you so much, Pamela, for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Do you prefer Pamela or Pam?
Pam.
All right. Okay. So I read a little bit about your background, about how did you get into educating people about sexuality and communication in your blog. And I think it's fantastic for our listeners to hear a little bit about that. So tell me, how did you get into this round of educating people about sexuality?
Sure. Yeah, it was not intended. This was not the path I set down when I started my career. I actually started as an engineer and then shifted into business and really enjoyed those jobs. I thought I'd do them forever. But kind of in the background, what was happening for me in my outside work life was my relationship with my husband was pretty good in a lot of respects. But when it came to intimacy and sexuality, we struggled a little bit from the standpoint of, it's very stereotypical, the things that we struggled with. They were, his desire was higher, mine was lower. And it was something that maybe every 6 to 12 months, it would kind of come to a head. And we would have a really difficult conversation about it where he was like, I would like more sex. And I said, I wouldn't. And it was really, really difficult. And we eventually found a coach and therapist to work with around that issue. And I honestly, when I ended up going to her, it was, or when we ended up going together to her, I didn't expect a lot of change. I kind of thought I was wired the way that I was and things were the way they were. And I was doing it because I thought it was probably a good thing to do, but I didn't expect change. And what I actually learned in going to her was was really transformative in our relationship. We have quite a healthy sex life now. And so as I discovered that, and I was going along that journey and starting to share with friends, I even started kind of writing about it publicly because I was like, whoa, people should know what I didn't know back then. So that's kind of the shorter version of what happened.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And it's so, as you said, unfortunately, it's so common. And I know my clients were coming, my friends, when they're struggling, everyone said, oh, that's marriage. That's how the relationship going to be, going to focus on positive. And they don't know that like there is another way. And I'm so glad that you were able to kind of address it and you're talking about it openly so people can learn from that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think people think, challenges are to be expected. And what I found was there's actually a lot of, I'm so glad that the challenge was there because I think where we are on the other side of that was way better than if we never had the challenge at all. So I think that's one of the very powerful things I've learned in this whole process.
Absolutely. So again, just so fascinating. And I was reading about it. You have a very good style of writing. It was like very interesting to read about it. So then I'm now going to just segue to our questions because I'm so excited about the topic. And I know that's something that you wrote extensively on that. So about shame, how do you think the shame shape our sexuality? What is its effect?
Sure. I think, I'll speak kind of from personal experience and then kind of brought into some of the things I've noticed in others and with clients as well. I think at the highest level, it just really limits, shame limits the full expression of our sexuality. And, sexuality can be this like huge, powerful, creative, inspiring, energetic force. And when we feel shame about some or all aspects of our sexuality, we really make ourselves very, very small. So for instance, like one of the messages that I think women in our culture get from a very young age is that if you like sex, something bad will happen to you. Or if you like sex, you are a slut. Mm-hmm. And men don't get very helpful messages either. They get messages like, if you show your desire, you'll be a creep. Your advances will be unwanted. And so when we're living in that kind of shame, that if I like this, I'm a bad person, or if I show this, I'm a bad person, we will make ourselves really small. We will kind of shut our sexuality off. I definitely did that. It wasn't something I was doing consciously at all, but that's definitely, I grew up in this world where like, keep it in your pants, but then when you meet Prince Charming, it'll just all magically work. Because I'd quote, kept it in my pants for so long. That didn't, I couldn't just turn it on. And then I think there's some other ways that shame shapes our sexuality around body images, like what should our bodies look like? Porn is so pervasive. We think we should look like that or we should like those acts. And certainly some of us do look like that and some of us do like those acts, but a whole bunch of other people don't, right? And so when that's one of the primary ways that we see sex in our culture, I think there's one last part too that I'm trying to wrap my head around now as I'm thinking about it, but there's this other aspect where we don't get taught a lot about sex or about pleasure, but somehow we think that we should know how to do it. And certainly there's like the animalistic nature, right? Where like, oh yeah, we can just have sex. But there's a lot about sex that we have to either learn about ourselves and then share with our partners, or they have to learn about themselves and share with us. And because we've got this idea that we should just know it, we don't have those conversations and we don't do that exploration.
Absolutely. And I love when you talk about different kind of like shame people have around different elements of like that's involved in sex. So for example, as you said, like body shaming, I work with eating disorder clients and even many clients who don't have eating disorders, but the feeling about like, my body is not the right type for sex. It's too small, too big. People are talking about how shameful they feel about like their sexual preferences. As you were talking about that, like women shouldn't supposed to feel sexual until they're in a like committed relationship, they're married. Right. But as you said, it's not that easy to turn it on and off. And it's off. My experience is that stays off, unfortunately, and they need to work on it. It's fascinating how pervasive this can be.
It is. It's such a huge issue for most people around sexuality. And like you said, it's shame from just the concept that I would like sex to something more like, the external image of my body to something really, really private and personal, like how do my genitals look? And there's just so many layers there. And it's a wonder that any of us ever have sex with all of these ways in which we can, have shame. It's no wonder people have sex with the lights off and, get into a routine about sex because it's scary to say, hey, I would want this other thing. Or what about if we tried this? Because you're worried, I'm worried that my partner is going to, or even to say like, I like it like this, because like maybe that's embarrassing somehow,
Right. Like talking about what you want and kind of making yourself vulnerable in that way can be very challenging because of the shame messages we got. So I'm just kind of curious. We talked a little bit about, we learn about we got some of these shame-based messages from our society, but based on your experience, what other places people get like this sexual, like shame around sexuality from? Where are these things coming from?
Sure. Yeah. Because it's interesting, right? I think if you watch like a little kid in life, like they're not born to be, they don't have body image issues. They're very interested in their genitals,
Right.
Like kids are very, very kind of naturally, I think, in their body and interested in pleasure. And then somehow things shift. So, like you said, culture is definitely a thing. I think that, there's other places that we get really bad sex education. We get sex education that focuses on all the things that could go wrong with sex.
Right.
And so I think that tends to, I think as humans, we can really latch on to negative things, and positive things we need a lot more reinforcement for. So the education we get's not really great. I definitely just got taught about infections that I could get, how I might get pregnant, how I might get raped, and I didn't get how it might feel good, and how I could, learn about my body in ways that weren't like super, super medicalized.
Mm-hmm.
So education's not great. I think, our parents, unfortunately, aren't comfortable with their own sexuality for the most part. Of course, there's exceptions to this rule, but I think, even with my own, I have a 9-year-old son, and I'm like in this field, and sometimes I don't know how to have certain conversations, so I think we get these messages sometimes from our parents. Church, definitely, some of us are exposed to environments where we get messages that, aren't necessarily super helpful in terms of keeping us, open and positive about sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about the parents, and it's so challenging because parents, like parenting doesn't come with a guideline or guidebook, and they're trying to do their best. I know that in my case, I didn't get no information about sexuality from my parents. And recently, after kind of having this podcast, we talked about it, me and my mother, and she was talking about how I was born in Iran, like right after revolution. And she's such a modern intellectual woman. And she was talking to me about, my values, they were different than the society. And I was scared. What if I tell you about those values and you would get rejected? You would get shamed. That's why she didn't say anything, which obviously wasn't a good idea. But it's so interesting that there are several things that impacting what kind of messages we give our children, what kind of sexual education we provide. And you talked about religion. And again, I think religion can be a great resource for people. But I know certainly in the environment I grew up, like it's just like sex was kind of a sin and all those negative messages associated being a sexual being.
Right. I had, my experience around religion was I attended this and it was my choice. My parents weren't taking me there, but there was this non-denominational Christian church in our neighborhood that I really enjoyed. I met tons of cool friends and they had a band and music and I really, really enjoyed the environment. And also they had us take an abstinence pledge. We wore a little bracelet and promised we wouldn't have sex till we were married. And, I wanted to fit in that group. And honestly, I wasn't interested in having sex at that age anyways. But it's still it definitely locked into my brain that that was the right way to be. And so, yeah, it was not very helpful to me, actually. That's the age where you do start to have feelings and enjoying parts of your body. And now it's paired with this message of, the right thing here is to not have sex.
Yeah. And I think you were talking about how we might not necessarily kind of accept those values, associate with them, but I feel in some part of your brain, those messages stay. Funny thing is again, I grew up in a non-religious family at all. My parents, they were atheists, but because of the culture of the community and the country at the time I grew up, I was constantly bombarded with this sin, those kind of messages, negative around sexuality. And I specifically remember that in one of their religious study classes that you're first to take, they were talking about how if you have sex before marriage, you would never, ever, no matter what kind of a good deed you do, gonna get into heaven. And I remember a split of the moment when I was when I wanted to have sex and obviously I had sex before marriage, but then it just came to my mind and I was shocked that I didn't even know it was there.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because these messages are very overt, right? That's, you're told directly, if you do this, this will happen to you or this won't happen to you. And so that's very, very direct and it's going to pop back into your mind later. And then I think there's other messages where, I learned to masturbate really young. Mm-hmm. I think I was 6 and I was at a girlfriend's house and we went down to her basement and she was like, if you lay down this way and wiggle this way, it'll feel really good, right? So this is how I learned to masturbate. I was young. And I remember being well, this is great. So I started doing it at home. And I don't remember, I'm young, I was young at the time and I don't have a good memory, but, I think I was probably told, to do that in your room in private. And that's not even that's not a bad message, right? I think most people, masturbate in private. So it's not a bad message, but I still internalize some shame around that. I think, okay, well, how, especially now with a kid, right? It's how could I have that conversation that, is a different one with my child? How can I say, yeah, feels good, doesn't it? Mommy does that and daddy does that and we do it different ways and some people don't do it and some people are really embarrassed by it. And, you always, anytime you're doing something sexual, you want to make sure that the people around you are okay. So it's not okay to do that in public, unless you can check with everyone around you, right?
I love that.
You know what I mean? It's how do you have these messages that we need or conversations that we need to have, but still reinforce that it's pleasurable and that it's safe and that people do it. And that's where I'm personally trying to figure out how I do that, right?
And I love the way you framed it. I never thought about it that way because I get one of the complaints I hear a lot from parents, for example, one parent was telling me that, oh my God, my daughter is a nymphomaniac and she's 4. She's masturbating. What do you think? What's going on? I was it's very normal. And we talked about it. And she was telling me that she's washing her every single time she masturbates. So kind of prevent her, distract her. But can you imagine what kind of messages that gives to the child?
Yeah, absolutely. Because how great is it that she's in her body and she's discovering it? And, is there a way to talk to her about that. And of course, there's age appropriateness. I found some really awesome books for younger kids where they're like little comic books, and it has like the bird who loves to talk about sex and the bee who doesn't like to talk about sex. And like, they're just so cute. And it's just such a great way to acknowledge wherever the child is at, because there's some kids who are super interested and want to talk about it, and other kids who are thinking about it because we all do, but are super nervous and embarrassed just naturally,
Absolutely. And I would love to learn more about those books.
Yeah, they're on my website.
Oh, great. I'll make sure I put a link. I'm
Okay,
sure
good.
I'm going to get lots of emails about those as well.
It always comes up, like anytime I'm talking with a group of women around messages we received and shame that we have, there's always that moment in the conversation where they go, oh no. And they realize that they're passing that down, because they don't know how to have another conversation. So I love the books as resources for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for mentioning them. So I'm thinking about the other thing is just like shame. How does come up for people? How can they know that? How can they identify that this is the shame message I got, where it's coming from? Because I said, as I was sharing with you a few minutes ago, it just can be very subtle. And like, I learned, like, I'm kind of tuning into my body and where I feel it. So what are some of the recommendations you have around that?
Yeah. So just in terms of how you can identify these things and figure out where they came from. Yeah. I think the figuring out where it came from thing, it may be important, but the figuring out that it exists and that, it's limiting me. Like I notice for me, when I'm in shame, I'm like shutting down a feeling, like I'll keep going with this masturbation example because that's really helpful.
Right.
So like, I noticed as I started to explore, like I was like, okay, masturbate, but I always do it in private, in my bedroom, like I was taught to do as a child, right? And I was like, but wait a minute, like this is kind of cool. Like, why don't I share this with my partner? And so like, I just would like, sometimes like things I just notice. So I had a client recently who she just noticed like, I'll put on this top and I'll look at myself in the mirror and think, oh, that looks really good. And then another voice will come in and say, you shouldn't wear that. That's showing too much skin. And so it's these voices at war in our head, like maybe I'll be having sex with my partner and I'll have a thought like, oh, I really want to do this, but I won't say it. Shame is probably at play there. Or like I'll see a guy passing in the grocery store and my mind will go into a fantasy because he attracted me and I was feeling good today. And I'll like instantly shut down the fantasy because, quote, I shouldn't do that. No one was going to be hurt by that fantasy.
Right.
But in fact, I was going to feel pretty good. I might have even smiled at him and he might have felt good.
Right.
What is the harm in that, right? It's in my head. So yeah, I think for me and what I've seen in others is there's that war going on inside, and shame is winning because we're not expressing ourselves, we're not sharing a feeling, we're not sharing a desire, a want, a need. We're shutting down pleasure. Like I think even outside of sexuality, I know that I have shame about doing things that aren't productive, like the concept that after we record this, that instead of going and doing something I'm supposed to do, that it's a pretty sunny day outside, I might want to take a 10-minute walk. Like I have shame about that. Like, why should I do that? I wouldn't be doing something productive. It's this war between the instinct of what I want to do versus like what I should do,
Right. And you were talking about secrecy. And I know it's just such a kind of secrecy. It's feeding into the shame. With some of the couples I work with, one of the reasons that like one of the partner, obviously it's always there are a number of different reasons, but like one of the partner was telling me recently that I was so shameful about this behavior I wanted to do. I couldn't do it with my partner. So I wanted to be with someone that was, she didn't know me and there was no attached. So it's just that you were talking about, the more we're open about it, we can reduce the shame or name it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think about all the things that you're scared to tell your partner, and so you don't, which means you don't give them the gift of knowing yourself better.
Right.
We were just sitting with our coach a week ago talking about this, so it's clear I don't have this all figured out, right? I think there's like layers and layers and layers to this.
Absolutely.
It's so powerful to be able to open up in that way.
So what can people do to build shame resiliency?
Oh, such a great question. I love it. Yeah, it's a lot of my work in this space. It actually just kind of triggered. I was thinking about it for a long time, but I was reading Brené Brown's book on shame.
I love her.
And it's so good. And, you know, I used to think, I have to get over shame. Sometimes comes in the form of like fear, or like paralysis. For me, shame is kind of like a froze, like I'm thinking, I have this urge, but I'm like frozen. I can't do it. I used to think, I have to get over this fear to have the courage to do something or to talk about something. And Brené had this great thing about how people who like live these lives without having shame run it is they don't get over their fear. They just do something despite the fear. Mm-hmm. And so this concept that, to build shame resiliency, I think talking about it is a huge antidote to shame. Sometimes that's all it takes, to be honest. What I love, I meet with a lot of women in groups to talk about sex. And what I love about it is, I could just have like 4 women together and I could just open up with a story about masturbation, obviously, and then go around in the circle and have women share their experiences. So there's no like teaching, there's no advice giving, there's no trying to change someone's perspective, like you shouldn't feel shame or you shouldn't feel this way. It's like literally them just saying, here was my experience. Mm-hmm. So it's as simple as like just sharing your experience and talking with someone. And when that happens in a group like that, everyone's like, oh, I'm normal. I'm not alone. Like you guys feel that way too. And I like, even as I'm saying it, like my whole body's relaxing.
Right.
It's like, like this is just, it's something I've like kept inside for so long because I had so much shame about it, or like talking to my partner about it. Sometimes I find friends is a little bit easier place to start because like with your partner, there's a lot of dynamics. And so it can be sometimes hard. So friends is a nice like gateway drug to talking to your partner. And then, talking to your partner, talking to your kids. Those are all, I think, really, really wonderful ways. There's also like way more extreme ways of dealing with shame. Like I really feel like I've just talked about masturbation this whole time. But around that topic, I found this woman in New York who had been basically having circles with women since the 70s. She's like, 86, 87 now. And she's been having circles with women since the 70s, basically sitting down and hers is really extreme, right? It's not just talking about it, but she's like, okay, everyone get naked and let's look at everyone's vulvas so we can see that this thing that we can't even see ourselves because it's like between our legs and we'd have to like twist to see it, see what they look like. See that they're all different colors, that they all have different hairstyles, that the lips are uneven and don't look like what they look like in porn. That I know that's really extreme and I wouldn't expect like most of the population to do anything like that. But of course I was doing research and it was good for me to do. But it was so powerful to have that experience to be like, oh, I'm normal.
Absolutely. I love that. And how courageous of her, because I feel just like, first of all, like expressing our vulnerability can connect us in a deeper level with another human being.
Right.
And also, I think absolutely, I see shame with everything, with addictions, with eating disorders, but also with sexuality. It's one of those things that unfortunately, as you were talking about earlier, that we haven't got like education, necessarily good education or any kind of like, right materials. We don't know that much about it. And it's so easy to feel that I'm different. There's something wrong with me. I'm not fitting in this image. So I love that you were talking about like sharing with it, and just listening can be very helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. I always think about, people are in different stages of being able to like look into some shame that they're feeling. Like sometimes, just reading about it or watching a TED Talk is like all I'm ready to do. And there's great books and resources for that. Sometimes I'm ready to, or blogs, sometimes I'm ready to start talking about it. And then sometimes I'm ready to actually seek help. Like I have figured some of this stuff out, but like I can't do it anymore alone. I actually need some help. Like, so that's where like coaches and therapists are amazing people. Like I definitely, they've been important on my own journey, and I see it for a lot of people. Because it's just this kind of acknowledgement of like, okay, I need more people on my team,
Right,
more people to support me in figuring this out.
Right. And as you were talking about, it's a journey. We might start with just kind of even like listening to something like this podcast or watching a TED Talk, and then kind of like maybe talking about it with a close friends or like family. So it can take a while until people are at the point that they can talk to like a group of people, or like, kind of naming it in like a bigger audience.
Yeah, I'm doing research on that right now, because it was so important in my own journey to have this group of women. I mean, we just like randomly started getting together. But as I started like telling people about it, they're like, we should get together. And so like, everyone was like pretending they were going to yoga and like putting on their yoga clothes. And we went to a park, and now their husbands all know, and they're like pushing them out the door. Go to that thing that Pam does. But like what I found was, it was such a helpful thing. So I started putting together, because I think a lot of women are like, well, that sounds great, but like, I think we're just going to get together and stare at each other with wide eyes because we don't know what to say or to talk about. So I started putting together content for women to have these circles. So like, in the first meeting, you could talk about social messages. In the second meeting, you could talk about body image, things like that, where I have like little discussion prompts. Because I think some people are like, I don't even know where to start. Like I get that I would talk about it, maybe, but I don't know how to have that conversation,
Yeah, it's so much easier if you're kind of going through the like outline you have versus
like
the coming up. Yeah, absolutely. I like the reframing of it. Are you kind of like recruiting people for this research? Where are you with that?
Yeah, so I'm about midstream through collecting data. So yeah, if there's anyone that's listening to this podcast and wants to get involved, they can certainly just host a circle anyways, even outside of the research. The materials are free, no strings attached, just the willingness to reach out and ask some friends if they want to talk about sex. And if the timing works out that they can be part of the research, it's all optional and anonymous and all that good stuff.
Oh, I love that. Can you send me the link, or just say it right now so people know if they're interested? How can they participate?
Sure. So it's Down to There. And if you see me, I'm pointing my fingers down, downtothere.com. And there's a tab there that says circles, and it's got some information and my contact information. There's also a resources tab on that same website that has the books that I was talking about, kind of categorized by various topics.
Fantastic. Again, I'll make sure I put a link on it, because I know sometimes people are driving, they're not able to write it down. That's great. And I definitely want to hear the results. So we got to have you back.
Wonderful. I'd love to come back. This has been a great conversation.
All right. Same here. Have a great day.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
I really enjoy talking to Pam. You can hear her excitement and her passion, even her voice, when she talks about sexual education and the relationship between sexuality and shame and guilt. And this is something very close to my heart, the topic of shame and guilt around sexuality. As I mentioned during the interview, I grew up in a very shame-based environment, and that's why I'm feel very passionate about this topic. And also my other areas of specialties are addictions and eating disorders. And I see it every day in my practice that how feeling shameful about one's behavior, about one's body, number of different things can negatively impact people's life and gets in the way of them embracing who they are. One thing that I learned throughout these years is that when you talk about what you're feeling shameful about, whether it's in the circle, which would be fantastic, or even talking about it with a person, one friend, colleague, or family member that you feel comfortable with, the pain you're experiencing will significantly get less. I think based on my experience, the more we keep our shame secret, the worse it will get and the more powerful it will get. So almost without it, you take away the power from it. And I know that many people might not feel comfortable about talking about something that they feel shameful around sexuality and sex, or they might not have someone in their life that they feel safe talking about this struggles. One other option would be kind of looking in online, that like there are different forums for a number of different things. And if you're feeling safe, kind of posting something about what you're feeling shameful about, or kind of like maybe experiment with it and see if it's a safe place, what kind of response you would get. And if hopefully it's supportive, how the response that you get kind of reduce the burden. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so excited to hear from you guys. And next week, we're going to talk about masturbation. So feel free to send me your questions about masturbation, Dr. Moali at sexology.com. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening to Sexology Podcast. For more great content, visit www.sexologypodcast.com. Please be advised that information presented on this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health provider.